No. 86, 1986. We are starting the panel today. This is, in some ways, the most exciting panel that you will see because the topic is so spot on and powerful. For years, the Heartland Institute's been talking about not just reforming the EPA, we've advocated getting rid of the EPA. But we finally have a president in office, an administration that's taking reforming the EPA seriously. So it's very nice to have a panel about this. Protecting clean air and water, everybody, conserving our natural habitats, everyone wants that. No one I know, every time I hear people accuse someone like me of being anti-environment, we want dirty air. It's like, how could that be? I like to breathe like the next guy. I want children, the next generation, to live better than me, just like my parents. No one I know hates the environment. But there is an issue of how best to go about protecting it and how best to help humans thrive. And Trump gets this. How can the Trump administration return the EPA to its core mission and root out agency environmental extremists? This is what this panel is all about. And we've got some great speakers to discuss it. First up is going to be Steve Milloy. Known Steve for a long time, longer than he might care to admit. His latest book is Scare Pollution, Why and How to Fix the EPA. He's the founder of, right on, spot on, right? How to Fix the EPA. Founder of junkscience.com. He's been a leader in the fight against junk science for more than 25 years. Second speaker, Dave Stevenson. Haven't known him quite as long, but I've known him for a couple of years now. Director of the Center for Energy Competitiveness at the Cesar Rodney Institute. He's published over 100 analytic studies, including major studies on regional greenhouse gas initiative, the Clean Power Plan, and electric grid reliability. Myron Ebell, I have known the longest of them all. He is one of the people in the free market environmental movement that I admire the most. He's one of the hardest working people in this field, and of course, aside from being the director of the Competitive Enterprise Institute's Center for Energy and Environment, and I worked for CEI at one time briefly, and he run the Cooler Heads Coalition for more than a decade. He led Trump's transition team on the Environmental Protection Agency, so there's nobody that was more inside on what Trump is doing and what he hoped to accomplish than Myron Ebell. So that's who you get to hear from today. It's your pleasure, believe me.
Okay, good afternoon. All right, so a lot of what I'm going to talk about is actually in my book, which at one point in 2016 was an Amazon bestseller. So you might want to check it out. It's got some good things in it. If you were on the earlier panels and you were interested in the PM 2.5 story, it's got the whole thing right there. Now, as far as how to fix the EPA, first thing we have to do, everyone needs to update themselves. And probably most people in this room are pretty good, but we've all got friends and family and congressmen and everybody else need to be updated. What do I mean by that? Well, it's no longer 1970. This was the Cuyahoga River in 1970. This is what it looks like today. It's clean. Pittsburgh air, 1973. This is the skyline today. This is where we used to put our trash, in dumps. Well, today, we put them in landfills. It makes a difference, apparently. When we were kids, we used to chase the DDT truck. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Today, kids are suing. They lawyer up over carbon dioxide. Okay, so things have changed. Things have gotten a lot better. I mean, kids have nothing better to do today, right? This is important because we need to update our environmental laws and regulations. We are working off laws that the first Clean Air Act was passed in 1963. It was updated into the mess it is today in 1970, then 1977, then 1990. When in 1990 they finally took all the science out of the Clean Air Act. Clean Water Act, Superfund, all these other laws were written back in the day. There's a lot less understanding about the environment. We've gained a lot in experience and knowledge, and so we need to rewrite and rethink how we do environmental protection. EPA under the Clean Air Act has to review and, by default, tighten air quality standards every 5 years because that's what the law says. Well, we don't need to do that. It's not 1970 anymore. Our air is clean. I've been doing environmental issues since 1990. The air was clean then, but EPA has insisted on cranking down air quality regulations, and really just to great cost and no benefit. We need to sunset regulations that we write today because in 20 years they're not going to be applicable anymore. We don't need them. We need to continually rethink how we do environmental protection. We need to reinsert science into the laws. Clean Air Act amendments in 1990 took science out. EPA had a hell of a time fighting industry in the 1970s and 1980s on clean air laws because EPA was always junk science fueled. And industry would take them to court and industry would prevail. So Congress just decided to end that because EPA wasn't issuing enough regulations. Now, this last point here, a massive public and school re-education program. I was thinking last night listening at dinner, and it occurred to me, it's impossible to educate the public. It's just, you could educate people and for 50 years have something really good going, and then along comes a scare and it's all for naught. We really need to make sure that the people that are in charge are really well educated and up to date on what's going on. Okay, this is also important. We want to shrink the EPA. And as a matter of fact, Donald Trump wants to shrink the EPA too. Let me go back here. During the campaign, he said that he was disgusted at what EPA did and wanted to only leave like a little bit of EPA. I believe that's pretty close to his language. And the problem is we just had all these regulations, just a steady stream of regulations. None of them ever go away. They just accumulate. Like 46 times as long as the Bible. Those are the EPA regulations. They never go away. And this has got to end. Our environment is clean. We don't need this many regulations. Most environmental protection today is done in the states. Both Obama EPA administrators testified in Congress, made private comments, that most environmental protection is done, in fact, in the states. And there's probably is a role for federal EPA on international issues and interstate issues. And I think chemical registration issues, it makes sense to do that on a national level at some sort of regulatory group rather than have 50 states regulating, say, pesticides and new chemicals. But that's a much smaller mission than the EPA we have today. No more secret science. If you were in the earlier panels, we talked about PM 2.5. 95% of the market value of the coal industry was wiped out during the Obama administration because of secret science. For more than 20 years, EPA had been helping, its researchers had been helping EPA shield epidemiologic data that was eventually used by the Obama administration to crucify the coal industry. Congress has passed laws, or you've got bills out of the House to ban this. They're now pending in the Senate. At one point, the House actually subpoenaed EPA. Actually a subpoena, you don't answer a subpoena, you go to jail. EPA, nothing happened. This is the bill that Lamar Smith, is chairman of the House Science Committee, is retiring next year. He's been really terrific on this issue. For the last 3 Congresses, he's gotten out of the House something called the Secret Science Reform Act. In this Congress, he changed it to the Honest Act. So it's the Honest Act for the dishonest EPA. And all we want to do is, if you're going to regulate the public based on science, well, that science ought to be able to be reviewed by the public and the regulated community. And EPA has been hiding the data for all this time. This is one of my pet peeves, PAL review at EPA. In July, I had this op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, which basically lays out the problem. 20 years ago, when EPA first started regulating PM 2.5, its group of outside science advisors, a group called Clean Air Scientific Advisory Council or Committee, or CASAC. CASAC said, EPA, you don't have the science to regulate PM 2.5 on the basis that it kills people. Of course, EPA ignored CASAC and went on its merry way. Now, The composition of that KSAC panel was there's about 21 scientists. Two-thirds of them were independent. By independent, I mean they didn't get grants from EPA. So EPA didn't forget that, and over the next 20 years, EPA reconstituted the KSAC PM panels to the point where today, because of the Obama administration, there are 26 members on that committee. 24 of them receive grants from EPA. And we're not talking about $1,000, $5,000, $10,000 grants. As a group, these people have received hundreds of millions of dollars in grants from EPA. So of course they do EPA's bidding. EPA pays them to do the science, and then EPA, reconstitutes them to rubber stamp their own work. I mean, imagine going through school and being able to grade your own work. So that's what this Wall Street Journal op-ed was about. Now, fortunately, Scott Pruitt read it, and several months after the op-ed appeared, he decided that he was going to restrict people who served on these science advisory panels from receiving EPA grants. That was good. And look where we've gotten now. So the next wave of EPA science advisors actually can include people from this room, and in fact, they do. Last week, or 2 weeks ago, Scott Pruitt announced new members of the Science Advisory Board and KSAC, and of the 20 new slots, 7 were recommended by Heartland and Junk Science, are all our friends. Both new chairmen are our friends. Stan Young, who's in the audience here, he's new, and Bob Phelan, I hope Bob Phelan is still here, over there. They are members of the Science Advisory Board, and so, we're making progress. Okay, now another thing EPA needs to do is do real cost-benefit analysis, or if Rick Belzer is here, benefit cost analysis. I don't want to offend him. Over the years, when I first started out in the environmental business, the way to kill an EPA regulation was to show that the costs exceeded the benefits, and that was fairly easy to do. And someone like Rick Belzer at the Office of Management and Budget, he would zero in on that, and that would be the end of the regulation. But of course, EPA has learned to game the system. And one of the ways they game the system is through PM 2.5, because EPA has decided that PM 2.5 is responsible for 1 out of 4 deaths in America. Every one of those deaths avoided is worth $10 million. So when you have hundreds of thousands of people whose lives are worth $10 million, of course, it's very easy to come up with billions of dollars in regulatory benefits, which are going to exceed any cost analysis possible. The problem is with the scientists. And I've highlighted benefit because what I want to focus on is, are the benefits real? Okay, and the benefits are not real because the scientists are lying. If PM 2.5, I focus on that because that has been the Obama EPA's most potent regulatory weapon. Wiped out the coal industry with it. The Clean Power Plan is justified on the basis of that. Scientists know PM 2.5 doesn't kill, yet they propagate the myth. The next problem there is the economists. Okay? Now, the problem with economists is they don't care whether the science is correct or not. They just accept whatever the scientists say, what me worry, and go on and do their economic analysis based on these bogus benefits. Well, that's terrible. You're going to get the wrong answer every time. We have the industry guys. They're a problem too. The industry guys, when I first started out, industry's willing to fight EPA. Not anymore. Not anymore. They run away. They run away. They don't really support our groups anymore. Used to get some support years ago. Not anymore. They just run away. They don't want to have anything to do with confrontation with regulatory agencies or environmental groups or anything. It's just, it's bad. Now, where all this has, we've made some progress. A few weeks ago, Scott Pruitt got out his proposal to repeal the Clean Power Plan. And I think I have this. No, I don't. Okay. If you read the proposal is justified economically on what people like Stan Young and myself and Jim Enstrom and Bob Phelan have been saying for years, that particulate matter doesn't kill anybody. So we're making progress. Okay, we need to get government out of science, especially EPA. Now, the guy that I've highlighted here, he's one of Jim Enstrom's favorite scientists, Arden Pope from Brigham Young University. EPA science on PM 2.5 is so bizarre and so strained that Arden Pope has been forced to publish a paper basically concluding that blue sky air is more dangerous than smoking. Okay, and I'm not joking about this. This is true. Now, this is a way to think about it. EPA says that 1 out of 4 deaths in America is caused by particulate matter in blue sky air. Okay, it's 570,000 deaths a year. Well, the smoking, the anti-tobacco groups say, well, smoking kills 440,000 people. Well, how is this possible? Okay, how is this possible? It's not possible. And, it's because the 570,000 deaths annually is just totally made up. Another thing we need to do is we need to get EPA out of the business of writing laws. Every regulation is like a law, right? And Congress has conveniently delegated its responsibilities to agencies like EPA. If you're a manufacturer and you violate an EPA rule, you can face criminal penalties. Okay? These are laws. They sound harmless, rules, regulations, maybe get slapped on the, no, you can be criminally charged. What we need to do is force Congress to accept responsibility for writing these laws. It needs to go back to Congress. Right now we have this, when the Republicans took over Congress in 1996, they passed the Law Congressional Review Act, which is sort of a post facto review of agency regulation. So after an agency issues a regulation, it can be reviewed by Congress. That's not how it should work. If there's a major regulation, Congress should have to vote up or down on it. Judicial review, okay? A huge problem is the court system and how the court system looks at EPA, how they ignore science. If you've been wronged by EPA on a science issue, it's virtually impossible to get that in front of a court. Rarely has that ever happened. They're just not interested in science. There's a Supreme Court decision from 1984. It's called Chevron versus NRDC. And in that Supreme Court decision, they held that if a statute is, vague, a regulatory agency like EPA can do whatever they want. Now, fortunately, our newest Supreme Court Justice, Neil Gorsuch, he is an opponent of Chevron, so one day I hope to see that overturned. Of course, it would be nice if Congress would just, do the right thing. That's it? Okay. Now is the time to act. We have a Congress we have Congress at EPA, so read my book. Thank you.
We'll keep things moving. Hello, everybody. I want to thank the Heartland Institute for this opportunity. It's second only to the opportunity I got when I walked in to the EPA for the first time as part of the transition team. It was an exciting moment. I've got to tell you, the three of us were all on the transition team. Myron headed. In the building today is also David Schneer, who is on the team, and Amy Oliver Cook. There were 10 of us officially on the team. We're not allowed to talk about the action plan that we put together or whether it's being implemented. But I can put it this way. We volunteered. I had to walk away from my day job for a month or so. We had to take care of our own food. And even though the door you walk into at the EPA on Constitution Avenue is right next to the Trump Tower, we had to do our own hotel. So, the question I think that should be asked is, do we feel like we wasted our time based on what has happened so far in the last year and what we expect to happen in the next year? And I can assure you, none of us feel like we wasted our time. And that's all I'm allowed to tell you. So we'll move on to what's going on. So I chose Wilmington, Delaware because I live in Delaware. 1980 to 2016, you can see the number of days that we exceeded air quality index. So that's the index of the 6 criteria, pollutants plus ozone. I can tell you back in 1980 with 142 days, 40 of those days were 2.5 times the air quality standard, and it was a looser standard back then. We needed to clean up our air. I'm going to agree with Steve on this. None of us want dirty air. We should all be really proud of what we've done, where now we're bouncing along close to 0 days. And by the way, the standard allows you to skip a couple days. So in Delaware, we're actually at the standard. We're below the standard now. We're clean, officially clean. A couple of things to think about here. One is we're getting close to diminishing returns. How much better are we going to get? I will go on to the next slide here. So these are the individual pollutants. The red line is the standard, and it's just the 100% mark for each standard. The standards are all different, obviously. But you see a lot of these are really way below. Like look at lead, the smallest column there. Lead is 95% below the standard, yet in 2016 there was still a single area that had non-attainment. Now, a specific plan was arranged, and this year that last non-attainment zone will reach attainment for lead. So, I mean, that's great. But you also see there's a couple here. You look at ozone, the tall one on the end there, and PM 2.5, which we've had a lot of discussion on today. We're probably not going to get much better on those. And the reason is there's a huge natural component in both of those. Now, when the ozone standard was revised in 2015, there was a debate within the EPA of how you figure out what is the natural component to this. So the EPA came up with a computer model that said it's in the mid-30s, parts per billion. The standard was 75, it's now 70, but the 70 has been delayed for 2 years. So there was another group in the EPA who discussed it and said, well, what we ought to be doing is using the actual results from the most rural stations. And those tend to be in the mid-60s. So mid-30s to mid-60s, and we're setting a standard at 70. So now, if you're within 10%, if the standard is within 10% of the natural background, you're never going to meet the standard. There's always going to be that hot summer day when you go over the standard. So the EPA decided to rely on models, which we all know computer models are better than actual data. So the EPA is least consistent. They relied on the models. So I want you to think about this. Imagine what the EPA should look like if we have met all the air quality standards. Secondly, there's 15,000 people at the EPA. 7,500 of them are in the region offices. Now, when the EPA was formed, it made a lot of sense to have regional EPA offices. But now you've got state operations, tiny Delaware. We have less than 1 million people. We only have one congressional representative, and he should be like 6/10 of a representative, or she right now. With that small population, our state natural resource department has 750 employees. And there's a lot of other bigger ones around the country. So we don't really need the regional offices anymore. And so you cut that, and now you cut from being, it's a whole change of thinking. What should the EPA look like without regional offices, and with all they're doing is managing? We're not trying to improve the air quality anymore, we're just going to manage it. All right, now put the other hat on. Let's say you're a career professional at the EPA. How do you survive cuts that you could imagine from that type of thing? Well, 2 things you do. You find pollutants that we can't meet and you can always regulate. So you do that one with ozone. If you set the ozone standard low enough, the states will never meet it, and you can always regulate and control things. And you can do the same thing with carbon dioxide. So part of the push for to regulate those is to keep the EPA in its current form. So what's happened lately? First of all, the Obama EPA was so involved in what was going on with the climate change agenda, which the Climate Action Plan was just pervasive through the entire government, and particularly at the EPA. So you see here, on average, air quality improved 2% a year from 1980 to 2009, but only 1% a year during President Obama's term. Ozone improved 1% a year from 1980, or from 2008 to 1980 to 2009, but only 0.5% total under the Obama EPA. Superfund site cleanups dropped from 35 a year under President Bush to 16 a year under President Obama's EPA. 2010, the EPA took over the Chesapeake Bay plan. The states were doing great. They improved the index 49%, but since 2010, there's been zero improvement. So things really got out of control, and we're looking at diminishing returns. The worst thing is EPA lost integrity. I'm not going to go through this entire list. You can read it. I would like to talk about a couple of them. The one thing that really hasn't been dealt with is the second one. They're using exaggerated value of life. It's based on a survey. There's another way to do that. You can instead look at the cost, the value of lost earnings. If you do that, instead of $9 or $10 million per year of life, it comes down to less than $1 million, less than 10%. Skipping the required administrative procedures near the bottom there, the Clean Power Plan, the first iteration of that in 2014, they were going to replace all of that coal-fired electricity with energy efficiency. They had so many comments that you could never, ever do that. You would lose reliability, including from the National Reliability Labs, that they changed it, and they were going to meet it with renewable energy, wind and solar. A change that big requires going back through the Administrative Procedure Act. But if they had done that, they wouldn't have got the thing done before Obama left office, so they simply skipped that step. So what's happening now is the EPA is laying a foundation for progress. They're reviewing the options for ozone quality. And the actual thing they're doing is they're looking at like this lead non-attainment area. They're coming up with, they want to look first who's really out of attainment, and then come up with a specific plan for each area that's in non-attainment of how you fix that. And one of the things you have to do is go back and look at the individual air quality stations. I can tell you about one station that ozone always peaks in the afternoon. That happens to be when bay and ocean breezes come in. There's always more ozone over the water because there's nothing for it to interact with. So it comes in exactly at the time, and that station is just at the wrong place at the wrong time. It also happens to go, it brings the air over a swamp, which is releasing methane, which is a precursor for ozone. So when you do all that, you've got a crappy station. You ought to be doing something about the station. So they're going to be looking at those kinds of issues and coming up with specific plans. Looking at drinking water programs, cutting red tape for Superfund remediation. Butte, Montana, there's a station they've been looking at for 30 years. Administrator Pruitt went out there last week, and he's promising to come up with a plan of what we're actually. There's $40 million of money sitting there that companies paid for creating that site. The money's sitting there. We know we need to do something, so he's going to start taking action on that and cut through the red tape. Reinstating with actions with concerns about employment when you come up with a regulation, and reviewing better ways to interact. So one of the things, before the time is up here, I'm going to skip the rest of the slides, is what do we do about this? Now, I agree with the endangerment finding. It's probably going to take at least 2 more years to deal with that, if not more. Most of the things we're looking at improving, we're probably going to finish in the next year. But there's something I think is more basic, and some folks I've talked to don't agree with me, but I'm going to push it anyway. The people in this room ought to be getting ready to change the Clean Air Act. When you really get down to it, we need a public debate, and the only place you can do that is in Congress, of what you do about things like carbon dioxide. I mean, the Clean Air Amendment could simply be 3 words, excluding carbon dioxide. Or it could be more complex of saying we're going to set an example, set a level for ozone and maybe PM 2.5. And it's going to be set by the legislature rather than keep coming back and keep it coming back. Or it might be a whole redesign of the EPA based on the fact that the states are taking over and there's going to be less work for the EPA. So my feeling is the reason we're successful right now is we spent several decades preparing for the moment that we had a door open, and the door opened when President Trump was elected. And we were ready to walk in. We knew what needed to be done. We had the data, and we got it in place, and it's being done. And the really optimistic thing is, it is amazing. It's like Christmas with all the things that have happened in the last year and are going to happen in the next year. So we prepared for that. Now, changing the Clean Air Act is going to be a difficult job. But let's be optimistic about 2018 election returns. We may be presented with another opportunity where we can get the Clean Air Act done. But we have to prepare and educate our lawmakers starting now on what needs to be done to change that Clean Air Act. So thank you very much, and we'll be taking your questions soon.
Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. My first question, though, is I'm really surprised to see you all here. When I first talked to Joe Bast, I said, Joe, 5 p.m. after a full day? And he said, no, that's a prime time. And I said, yeah, there'll probably be about 20 people here. And so he was right and I was wrong. I have a hypothesis for why you're all here. And it's that I didn't know that Texas had licensing hours for bars and pubs. And they're all closed from 3 to 6. But thank you all for being here. I want to thank the Heartland Institute for inviting me. I've worked with Sterling and Heartland and many of the people at Heartland for a long, long time, long before I joined CEI. And I just want to say it's an indispensable group. You know, Sterling mentioned that I chair this nonprofit coalition called the Cooler Heads Coalition, and the Heartland Institute plays an indispensable role in the effort over the years to stop Kyoto, to defeat cap and trade, and now to, for example, get us out of the Paris Climate Treaty. And I want to mention Joe and Diane Bass because I think, Joe said he's retiring. I find that a little hard to believe, but Joe and Diane have worked like slaves for decades for the cause of freedom, limited government, and sensible policies. And we just owe them a whole lot, so I just want to really please convey, because you'll probably have a big party in Chicago, but I won't be able to come to it. Now, I suffered information overload. What? We call it awake, yeah. Well, you have a great new president, so I've known Tim when he was in Congress. Now, I suffered information overload about 11:30 this morning, and I've been trying to get over it ever since, so I'm going to be a little bit lighter than Steve and Dave here. Yesterday, at the meeting we had here, we celebrated the fact that 1 year ago today, President Trump was elected. And for those of us who were on the transition team, it turned out that we woke up 1 year ago today, and the work we'd done for the last 2 months wasn't just an exercise, that it was actually going to have consequences. So I just want to say where I think the Trump agenda is coming from and how environmental policies and reforms play into that, and energy as well. So I'm going to... President Trump, like the other Republican candidates, ran on a platform of economic growth. Now, here's the problem. For well over 100 years, the U.S., even through recessions, had 3% per annum economic growth until 2008, and I want to show you a detail of that. Our economy is now more than 12% below where it should be if we'd had 3% economic growth, which we haven't had for 15 years. And in fact, all of the defenders of the Democrats in power, like Paul Krugman and all the other academic economists, said, oh, the economy has changed. We'll never get back to 3% economic growth. President Trump ran a rather unusual campaign. He didn't have a set of talking points from last night's polls. He had these big rallies. I wasn't a Trump supporter. I didn't go to any of these rallies. But I found out once I started working for the transition that he was a very unusual candidate. He wasn't just a showman. He didn't just go to these huge rallies. He stayed for hours and hours afterwards talking to people. And he discovered something. He discovered that the heartland of America, where people dig up stuff, make stuff, and grow stuff for a living and don't manipulate financial information or electrons in a computer, that those people had had economic stagnation for 2 decades. And it was a result of government policies. It was a result of regulation and taxation and some other things. So my colleague Wayne Cruz, this is something that in 2011, Darrell Issa at the House Oversight Committee asked hundreds of companies and groups like Heartland and CEI, what is the major obstacle to doing business in your part of the world? Half the several hundred responses said the Environmental Protection Agency, and about 15% more said Fish and Wildlife, said DOE, the Endangered Species Act, things like that. Well, that was 2011. That was before the Obama regulatory avalanche occurred. So my colleague Wayne Cruz does an annual snapshot of the regulatory state called 10,000 Commandments, and he tots up all of the costs of regulation. These are just the identified costs. Currently, they're about $1.9 trillion in a $17 or $18 trillion economy, and the key point is these are the costs of existing business. These are not the opportunity costs of people who don't make investments and start new businesses and create jobs because of the current regulatory structure and tax structure and all of the obstacles that government puts up to economic activity. I don't think President Trump ever saw that graph, but he got it. He said we are going to get back to 3% economic growth because we are going to unleash investment in the resource and manufacturing economies. And we're going to start with energy, and we're going to start with EPA regulations. So he didn't have a policy apparatus in his campaign. You know, most presidential campaigns, Senate campaigns, they have a bunch of policy papers, and they're 20, 30 pages long, and they lay out the agenda, and they fudge every issue. They don't make any promises. President Trump, during the campaign, didn't have a policy shop, really, until May of 2016, and it was just a few people. He started giving speeches. The first speech he gave was in Bismarck, North Dakota on May 26, 2016, and he laid out his agenda for energy and environmental reform. Now, what is the goal of all of the Obama regulations created over the last 5 or 6 years? Organize the entire U.S. and global economies around programs to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. That is, around reducing use of coal, oil, and natural gas, and turn robust economies based on producing and using abundant energy into economies based on using much less. That is, turning Texas into California. That is the goal of the Obama administration and the Democrats in Congress. It's to make everything look like John Piscopo, make it look like Connecticut, A lovely state being ruined by the political majority that it has driven the economy into bankruptcy. So President Trump said, I'm going to do some things. He made 42 or 43 promises on energy and environment. 15 of them applied to the EPA. So the goal of the transition, and now the goal of the administrator and his team, Scott Pruitt at EPA, is to implement those promises. And as people have said, Scott Pruitt is making a great start on that. The president is making a great start. Steve misspoke. He said that President Trump said he'd leave a little bit of the EPA. He actually said, I want to abolish the EPA. We may leave a little bit. I'm with the abolish side, but we'll go on to that. So what is the goal of the Trump deregulatory policies? If you can't read the caption, it's we'll always have Pittsburgh. Well, with President Obama's policies, we weren't going to have Pittsburgh. Remember, Detroit in 1960 was one of the wealthiest cities in the world. Now large parts of it are farmland. Chicago is about 20 years away from heading down to where Detroit is now. So we won't always have Pittsburgh if we commit to policies that are based on the Paris agenda, the Paris Climate Treaty. President Trump actually wants Pittsburgh to remain Pittsburgh. So what we now face, and I would say this is a problem. Scott Pruitt can do a lot of things, and Steve mentioned the science advisory boards and so on. We have to codify as many of these things into law as possible, or else they will be undone by a future administration, either Democrat or typical Bush establishment Republican. That's not going to be easy because the Senate no longer is functional. So I have some thoughts on that, but I don't have time to give them to you today. Maybe you'll ask a question. What do we do about the Senate besides abolishing it? But I want to say this is a moment where the path we were going down was going to turn all of the United States into a model of the California economy, where people who are in Silicon Valley or Hollywood or have big public pensions do fine, but people in the Central Valley are reduced to third world status. That's the path we were going down. President Trump has now allowed the states that don't want to go down that path to revive economically and to let freedom out again. And if California and Connecticut and Illinois and New York want to keep going down that path, then under our system, they have every right to do so. And let's see how it turns out. That's what an experiment in federalism is all about. So I think we have reached a tremendous turning point in the history of this country on environmental policy. I think it's great to talk all day about producing more energy, but the problem is, under the current regime, until President Trump and Scott Pruitt dismantle it, you can't use that energy. So this is a great moment. Everybody should savor it and keep pushing. We need to support everything that the Trump administration is doing that's moving towards less regulation and more freedom. And we need to oppose them when they start going bad, when the swamp starts taking over, which is, I'm sure some of you are aware, President Trump has allowed some parts of the swamp already to invade parts of his administration. Not the EPA, but some other places. So there's a lot of work still to do. I think one of the problems that Republicans have, or conservatives, is that once their guys get into office, they say, oh, all the work is done, we can relax. The environmental movement doesn't do that. The environmental movement will get 95% of what they want from an administration, and they'll complain and say we're being sold out because we didn't get 100%. We say we get 50% of what we want, and we say thank you. We shouldn't do that. Now, the other problem is the correlation of forces is still against us. I mentioned this last night. The top 10 environmental groups have a budget of over $1 billion a year. The top 50 environmental groups have a budget of over $3 billion a year. CEI has a budget of $8 million. Jay, what's Heartland?
7.5.
So, well, we're the same size. We're the two biggest groups working on these issues from a free market perspective. So you see what we're up against and why we can't relax. And with that, thank you very much.
Okay, we have about 10, 15 minutes for questions. He will recognize you, and I ask that you identify yourself and direct your question to a particular person, please.
There was a sound. I'll take it. You got to hold it? Okay. Mr. Stevenson, you worked for Dow Chemical. You lived in Delaware. You were on the transition team. Thank you. But what a sour note you hit when you told me that the national air quality standards that were pushed on us in the 90s were things that you were kind of okay on, happy on. I'm sure that you became unhappy with the EPA at some point. Tell me when you got unhappy. Tell me whether you think the process that produced the national air quality standards in the 90s is something that you would say, well, we can allow that as a kind of a well-intentioned mistake.
Well, I still wouldn't say it's a mistake. I believe that air quality we have now, that when the EPA has done NOx, they have used pretty sound science to determine the NOx. Not all the time. Ozone standard didn't do that. But most of the air quality standards do have fairly sound science behind them. We can argue whether it's 75 parts per million on ozone or 85 parts per billion. But the fact that we set a standard and we met it is something to be proud of. Now, to answer your question, when did I get interested? I spent 23 years at DuPont. I spent the last 20 years being an entrepreneur. After leaving DuPont, I was worried about running businesses. I was worried about my 7 kids and 17 grandkids. When I got unhappy with the EPA about 7 years ago, when I went into the next career of working in public policy and actually looked closely at it. So I've been fighting all of this for the last 7 years. And for most of us, you spend your life doing what you need to do to raise your family and just run your business and get by. Not everybody has time to spend all day, every day working on this stuff. I do it now 14 hours a day, so well, I'm making up for it.
I do it about 14 minutes a day.
Hi.
Well, you're that much more efficient.
No,
Ed Emery from Missouri. And just, I mean, seriously, given the, I guess, the history and the harm of the EPA, is there a constitutional and functional purpose to have an EPA?
Well, you know,
No.
when Richard Nixon formed the EPA in 1970, all the functions that EPA has now or had then were already being done by other agencies. And what Nixon did was, as a sop to the anti-war movement, you recall the time, he just combined everything into EPA and created this, haven for left-wing activists. And so that's what it's been ever since. Do we need the EPA? No. We could split up its functions, send them all around. States do it now. 1970s, states really couldn't do anything. Dave said there was nothing in Delaware. But now Delaware's got a very robust department. So, the problem is, we're still operating with a 1970s mindset. And it's actually probably a 1950s or 1960s mindset. And kids go through school, they think everything is polluted. I mean, if you listen to environmentalists, the environment is more dangerous today than it ever was. It's totally nuts.
Well, I would say, I don't want to answer that question because I hate to be quoted later like Kathleen Hartnett-White was yesterday at her hearing. It's why it's not wise to be appointed to, am I working here? Can you hear me? Not really. Okay. Well, I don't want to answer that question because it gets quoted back when you say things like, well, I'd like to abolish the EPA because I don't think it has any constitutional standing, so I won't say that. I do think we're in a situation where we now have an opportunity to downsize the scope and the size of the EPA. And Mick Mulvaney, the director of OMB, and he is the true superstar of this administration, he proposed in the president's budget for this fiscal year a 31% cut at EPA and getting rid of 3,800 out of 14,700 employees. If you have 3,800 fewer regulators, you're going to have a lot less regulation. So the Congress, the House, which is the more conservative body in our current setup, they voted out of the House a 6% cut, not a 31% cut. So what I would like to say is, for those of you who don't think that the EPA has any legitimacy, tell your congressman or your senator that you prefer 31% rather than 6%. That's a start. Let's move towards a 1/3 cut in the EPA and then see where we are.
Bob Phelan, University of California, Irvine. First, thank you, Steve Milloy, for your book, and thank you for the transition team. I was really worried about how that transition was going to go, and it's nice to see that people who know what they're doing were involved. The point I'd like to make in a question is, we do our standards one at a time, and even though you could justify a standard for something, like maybe ozone, you can justify that. When you enact and enforce that standard, it can do orders of magnitude more harm to public health than it improves public health. So I'd like to know if the EPA could be restricted to not enacting legislation that does substantially more harm to public health than benefit from restricting that one particular chemical. Is that a clear question?
Well, yeah, no, it's a great question. And actually, Senator John Barrasso tried to raise that in the last, in the last Congress, or the last couple Congresses. He's tried to make that point. EPA tends to put people out of work, and when you go out, when you lose your job, as you pointed out earlier, your health and your family's health.
Risk,
right. Right, and EPA never considers those things in its cost-benefit analysis, and it's completely escaped the government. And Senator Barrasso has tried to bring that back. So, but not enough people talk about that. I mean, think about all the coal miners that lost their health care, and then all the the thousands of coal miners, and then there's even tens of thousands more people that support those coal. All those people have lost their livelihoods.
EPA will say we can't take costs into account.
Well. No, I hear you. Look, there's even a provision in the Clean Air Act where EPA is supposed to take into account the effects of its regulations, and my old boss, Bob Murray of Murray Energy, had to go to federal court in West Virginia and sue EPA, and EPA is still fighting it. So, I mean, everything is a battle with EPA.
If I can just interject, for every agency, EPA doesn't matter, but we're talking about EPA, there should be a Hippocratic oath they have to take. Firstly, do no harm. The government shouldn't be in the business of hurting people. They're supposed to help.
That's a novel.
One of the very positive things that happened in the repeal, the regulatory impact analysis for the repeal of the Clean Power Plan, is that the EPA did reject the concept of doing co-benefits. The statement was we can do more good. If we want to regulate PM 2.5, we regulate that rather than do it as a co-benefit and then do it for the next regulation and the next regulation, where you're just double counting the same benefits. So I think that's a little bit different than what you said, but it's Bob. But it's in the same idea. You ought to be regulating just one pollutant, not everything in one regulation.
I think we have time for more.
I've got a question for Dave Stevenson. In your slides, you had a bullet point you skipped over very quickly, and I think it's very important. It's already been peripherally discussed. This idea that EPA is supposed to look up at the impact of its regulations on jobs. Now, as we know, it's been negligent and remiss in the past. If they ever did an honest analysis of that, most of the regulations proposed have never been passed. With the Murray coal suit, et cetera, do you see that changing now?
Yes, very, very much so. You can already see some of that going on in the Clean Power Plan repeal. They're taking more a closer look at the impacts, and that slide was actually a summary of what the EPA released as their goals just last week. So I have a lot of confidence. And I'm already using it at the state level because the state environmental group was using the same strategies as the EPA, and I'm telling them that you can't do that. The EPA doesn't support it anymore. They were always leaning on the EPA. So they'll count everything as a benefit, including indirect and other economic benefits when it's to their advantage, but they won't count it on the cost side. But yeah, I have promise for that.
I think this will be the last question.
My name's Michael Ellison from North Carolina. So my question is, what do we do about the Senate?
Well, it's
funny.
Yeah, well, look, with all of the executive actions, the overreach of President Obama, many of which were illegal, but Congress wouldn't assert its prerogatives and its authority, and the courts won't get involved in a dispute between the two branches. We are really on the verge of what happened to the Roman Republic when it was replaced by the empire. The Roman Senate remained in operation, but it just became a talking shop. And that's what we're in the danger of, because the Senate now cannot pass anything. And the reason the Senate cannot pass anything is because of this silly idea of the filibuster. The filibuster is not what happens now. They call it the filibuster, but it's been distorted. The filibuster was, if you really oppose something, you can keep the debate going by going to the floor and talking until you're exhausted. Now, what filibuster means is one senator puts up his hand and says, cloture vote, so they can't proceed until they get 60 votes, which is what was needed to end a filibuster. So this is a complete distortion of what the filibuster was for. And so at first, when they started doing this cloture vote thing, members had some, self-control. They would only do it when it was really important to them or their state. Now they do it over anything, right? Everything now requires 60 votes to proceed to debate and a final vote. Well, the Democrats won't vote for cloture on anything. And if the Republicans were in the minority, they probably wouldn't vote for cloture on anything. Well, they would, but... So that rule, if they could reform that rule, the Senate could once again become a responsible legislative body. But I want to... yesterday, Jim Lakely kept saying about how every panel at our meeting ended on a down note. I want it to end on an up note. In 1992, President George Bush got us into the Rio Climate Treaty, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, And his chief of staff, John Sununu, told the Senate conservatives, oh, don't worry about it, it's entirely voluntary. In 2001, George W. Bush said, I have a new plan for regulating pollutants under the Clean Air Act. We're going to do them all at the same time on the same schedule. And I've got an even better idea. We'll also start regulating carbon dioxide emissions from clean power plants. Those are the last two Republican presidents, and that's what they've given us. President Donald Trump, because he's a little bit of an oddball, had the courage to say, we're done with all of that. We're done with talking about climate. We're done with having a climate agenda. We're out of the Paris Treaty. And, you know, by God, I don't care whether the whole world is against me, because this is what is good for America and good for its citizens and good for freedom in this country. So I want to end on an up note. That's where we've come.